Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Author Life Chat show with me, your host, Jasvina, for Sundays Stories from the Unsung Heroes. So, today we have a professional Backgammon player to talk about luck and skill on the professional Backgammon tour. It's going to be an interview with Robert Wachtel, author of the Backgammon Chronicles. So, before we proceed with the interview today with Robert, let me just introduce Robert briefly to you. Robert is currently ranked a world number 11 on the peer rated survey, The Giants of Backgammon, and Grandmaster second class by the Backgammon Masters awarding body, BMAB. Robert Wachtel has been one of the game's elite players for the last 40 years. A chess master, doctor of philosophy, and options trader, he is the author of two prior Backgammon books, In the Game Until the End, that was published in 1993, and In the Game Until the End Volume 2, that was published in 2014, and more than 40 journal articles. Robert was the editor of the U.S. Backgammon Federation's flagship magazine, Primetime Backgammon, from 2011 to 2019, and he is the author of The Language of Backgammon, a Player's Dictionary, a companion volume to the Backgammon Chronicles. So let's welcome Robert to our show today. Hello, Robert.
Hello, Jasvina.
How are you?
Great. Nice to be with you.
Awesome. Right. So thank you for joining us for Sunday's Author Life interview with me. So I'm so glad to have you on our show today. And we're going to talk about your experience in as a professional Backgammon player and also about your book, right? So could you actually tell us about some background about yourself and also about Backgammon itself and how you happen to become a player?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Thank you. The world has a few really great games, and they are the product of many, many generations of people basically experimenting with games to come up with something that works really well, and that also is sort of symbolic of life. For example, chess is like that, and it represents the qualities of strategy and planning, and it tells you the moral that if you do the right things and you think ahead, you will be rewarded. But of course, it's not a perfect model for life, because life has a lot of luck involved in it. Much more, actually, than most people realize. Where you're born, whether you're born healthy or not healthy, basically how your life goes from when you're small to when you're older, there's a tremendous amount of luck involved. But of course, there's still some things to do right or wrong, and if you're play your cards right, you might say, you'll probably do well. And backgammon is a game like that. It combines luck and skill in a very beautiful way. And my point is that after centuries and centuries of people playing this game, it's more than 3,000 years old, maybe even older. It's stood the test of time, and it's just sort of a beautiful balance of these conditions. So yeah, it's a very old game, and it's the most popular game in the world, perhaps, if you consider the Middle East, where almost everyone plays backgammon. The old, rich, the poor, the young, young and old. I said that, sorry, but people of every walk of life, and they all love the game and play it, and it's centuries old there, and you can't find anyone who doesn't play pretty much. In the West, the game started in. It's also very old, but it came into some clubs, private clubs eventually. But there are there's lots of art from the 17th century and so forth that shows people playing backgammon, usually in an inn surrounded by donkeys and little kids, and they're a lot of times they're fighting over backgammon because it brings out the passions that people have. But in the West, it took it went into hyper mode in the 1920s because some genius invented what's called the doubling cube, which makes the game even much more skillful and interesting than it has been for centuries. As for myself, I found backgammon fairly late, like in my late 20s. But I had been a chess player before that. And chess is a tremendously demanding sport, and it's almost impossible to make money at it. Mm-hmm. I wanted to become a chess player, but my parents insisted that I could not be what they called a chess bum. And that meant go to college. And then I didn't quite know what to do with myself, so I went to graduate school. I found philosophy, which I really enjoyed. I got a doctorate in it. And before I could become a professor in a university, I went back to the chess club. And this was in the late 1970s when backgammon was a fad in the United States. It was part of what you might call the Playboy culture. Hugh Hefner played backgammon. James Bond, if you watch his movies, is a backgammon player also. And it was considered part of this romantic and glamorous lifestyle that a lot of people wanted to participate in. Now, this didn't mean that they knew how to play. In fact, they were all terrible. And they didn't have the kind of mental discipline that I did as an ex-chess player. Chess is a game where nerdy, geeky kids study the game for hours and hours and hours and days and weeks and do nothing but think about how to outsmart somebody in some opening. And all the people who I met at that time just sort of believed in luck. And they figured, I'm lucky and I sort of know how to roll the dice and that sort of thing. So that doesn't really work that well. And I was immediately able to make some money. I started playing basically with my friends, but I was better than them. I was able to start traveling, and that's how it started anyway.
Mm-hmm. Right. So it's actually interesting to learn that you are also a chess player. I mean, you were a chess player before becoming a backgammon player, right? So could you tell us about how these two games actually differ, and how you think that you prefer playing backgammon than chess, because chess is definitely a game that so many people out there they love playing chess. So tell us about the perception of people viewing backgammon as a professional game versus chess as a professional game.
Well, it takes a little bit of a different personality by backgammon. A chess player is generally a control freak. They want to make things happen the way their mind, directs things to happen. But in backgammon, the dice are very capricious. You cannot control them. They're like little gremlins.
Mm-hmm.
They screw you up. And just when you're about to do something that you've planned, it explodes.
Mm-hmm.
And this is very hard to deal with for most people emotionally. Even
Mm-hmm.
though people do love the game, but you'll find so many of them who want to tell bad luck stories and talk about how, and it was called by one of the pioneers of the game in the 1970s, a fellow named Barclay Cook. He called backgammon the cruelest game.
Mm-hmm.
It does the reversals of fortune are very abrupt, and only one roll of the dice can destroy a beautiful game that you've played perfectly up till then. And so this means that there's only a small percentage of people have the calm and equanimity to deal with this kind of thing, especially if you're a professional. Because if you're a professional, I actually was careful even with girlfriends, because I didn't want a girlfriend who would sympathize with me, because I thought that would be counterproductive. Because I would be tempted to just go and cry on her shoulder, and she would say, "Oh yes, Robert, you're a wonderful person. Don't worry, everything will be fine." But no, you have to actually find within yourself this the strength to just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the human mind is very funny too, because what we all want to do when we play is we want to win.
Mm-hmm.
But we want to win every time we play. But this is completely impossible. It's actually impossible in everything. I mean, I play tennis too, and a lot of tennis players will tell you that most of the time, if you play in a tennis tournament, you're going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
If you win the whole tournament, you're going to lose somewhere. Well, backgammon is much worse than that. Even if you play somebody who's much worse than you, they're going to win 40% of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that means you have a lot of losses.
Mm-hmm.
And the human mind is not really constructed so that you look at it and you go, well, in the end, I'm ahead. I won more than I lost, because most people suffer when they lose, and it annoys them, and because they can't control, and the winning doesn't quite compensate, or they don't feel, if they win 60% of the time and lose 40% of the time, they don't feel like a winner.
Mm-hmm.
They feel like, that wasn't so great. I lost to that guy, and that guy's no good, and this sort of thing. So, it's very different. And that's what gambling is like too. Like, people who are real gamblers, here's how I look at gambling. So most people are constructed this way. If they win twice and lose once, they're about 50-50 happy.
Mm-hmm.
But a gambler, if he wins once and loses 5 times, he's 50-50 happy, because he gets so much pleasure out of winning the one time that it compensates for all the losses. But that's very abnormal, and you have to be, at the right proportion. So I forget where I was going with that, but that's the way the games are different psychologically.
Mm-hmm. Right. So your book, the Backgammon Chronicles, right? So you say that it is actually filling a gap in the literature, right? In the current pool of literature that is pertaining to backgammon. So Could you explain to us about how your book is different and how actually that fills the gap in the literature that you found?
Sure, I could. Yes. Well, I've been playing for a long time, even since the 70s, the late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And back then, backgammon was a game of romance and stories and little bits of mythology, sort of.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but then what happened is some people invented computer programs that could play backgammon better than you.
Mm-hmm.
And people started to realize that, I can learn this game. It's not just all luck. Well, this was a really good thing, except that the backgammon community took it way too far.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the game is a great, fun game, and you can travel and do things and meet the most interesting people, and especially rich people with lots of money who don't mind losing it, and will, you can go to the best resorts and have a beautiful scene around you and a milieu. And but what happened is all the people who wrote books for the last 35 years have written, the books have all been about how to win, how to play certain kind of position and what is the percentage here and there. It's very dry, and it doesn't really attract people to the beauty and romance of the game and to the joy of it. It's so the game has gotten a little bit inbred, and there are many people who are terrific players, and they've learned from the computer. And but it's a bit geeky because those are people who, aren't really expressing the fun of the game. And the other thing is about that game players are usually pretty mathematical people, and they're pretty calculating. And that's what they call a left-brained person. But to write about a topic, you need the right side of your brain, which is the literary or verbal part. And there are very few of the great players who have that. And there's another factor too, which is that the great players, most of them, when they were making money, didn't want to have any publicity. They wanted to be sort of underground, and never to show, never to share their secrets, but also never to sort of boast and brag and say, "Hey, look at me! I do this." So that created a situation where the best players really didn't want to write books, and nobody came along for whatever reason. I mean, these are three pretty good reasons, but there still could have been a few people who came along who glorified the better players and described, the cut and thrust of the game and the way that players think and act and the experiences they have. In chess, there were always people like that and they were never good players, really. They were very average players, but they glorified the great chess players, and they were hero worshippers, actually, of the great chess players. So they wrote books that were great fun. When I was a kid and I read chess books, there were stories about the great players and how they how they were outwitted or they made their way. And none of that has been done in backgammon forever. And I started writing the articles that were the forerunners of this book 10 years ago, when backgammon was going through one of its many renaissances. It's had a lot of them in the last 40 years. And this was one that was created by poker. In 2003, poker became tremendously popular. It's always been popular in the US, but this fellow called Chris Moneymaker won he had an amazing name, and he won the World Series of Poker, and that started everybody investing in poker. There were poker shows all the time, and the reason that that poker was so popular was that the inventors or the producers of these programs invented a little camera that could show the players' cards. And this made everybody think, oh, that's easy. Why can't that guy see the other guy's bluffing? I mean, I see it. And a lot of people in the backgammon world tried to imitate that, and there was actually a World Series of backgammon, and a lot of some money anyway, a lot of money got invested in it. And that was around the time when I started writing these articles that are the basis of the book. And at that time, there was a lot of online play too. You could play backgammon online for money, and it was wild. So
yeah, you're trying to say that basically the books that were written before this about backgammon is all about the technical how.
Yes. And in fact, I wrote a couple of books like that. My earlier books in the game until the end are quite technical. But while I was doing that, I was also, memorializing my experiences and writing stories. And there's a lot of lore too, a lot of stories from the old days that, another reason I want to publish this book is that all these things would be forgotten in a few years. There'd be no one left who remembered and knew about them. And it was a magical kind of time.
Right. So speaking about backgammon, we all know that it's actually a dice game and therefore it's all about luck. But if that is true, how could anybody hope to be a professional, and just by having probably better luck than others? How does this even work? And probably could you tell us a little bit about how far luck actually plays its role in one's journey towards becoming a professional backgammon players?
Yes, well, I did start saying a little bit about that when I described how when I started playing, I had an advantage over these people who did believe it was all luck. And the most amusing thing to me is I have a friend who's a brilliant man. He's also a PhD in philosophy. He was my friend, and we went to the University of Toronto together. And I had him proofread some articles that I wrote, not for this book, but for some other project I was doing. And he was like, well, so you don't believe in luck. You don't believe in luck. I mean, he was sort of very exercised by the idea that I didn't believe in luck. Or he said, you don't believe in luck. And I said, of course I believe in luck. And it took me a long time to realize he meant something completely different from that. He meant when the common person believes in luck, they think of it as something that somebody possesses. If you have luck, then it's something that you are born with. And I couldn't believe that someone who was as intellectually as advanced as he was could even think that way. Because for me, it's clearly not that. But there is a tremendous amount of luck in life and in backgammon. But it's very similar to the idea of how you play your cards. In other words, you can think of, I mean, maybe cards is for the common person, cards is a better, easier metaphor because of that expression. The idea that you're dealt some cards, which is where you were born, who your parents are, whether there's a war in your country, whether there's inflation in your country, whether you're healthy, all these sorts of things. Those are the cards you're dealt, and then you make the best of them. And that is how you do well in life, and that's how you do well in a game that has as much luck as backgammon. And another phrase that comes to mind that is part of the common lexicon or whatever is playing the odds. People understand what that means. That means that you go with the probability that the thing you're doing will work out. And so what I say about backgammon is that a backgammon player is a statistical scientist. It's someone who's calculating odds and going with the odds, even though they may lose, and they may lose again and again and again. In the life of a professional, you sometimes have bad luck streaks that last for weeks and months, and you just can't believe it. And of course, everyone cries, and they, look for sympathy from their friends or their other players and tell stories. But it's actually true that everybody is dealt a certain amount of luck in their life, some more than others. There's one or two people in the world who are insanely lucky, but that's just statistics. There's the bell curve, which is something like this.
Mm-hmm.
On this, it's got the tails on the side, and in every population, there's a few people who are really on the tails. There's some people who are so horribly unlucky, you could die for them because everything goes wrong. And there's some who are blessed and everything goes right. And most people are somewhere in the middle. And it's a matter of making the best of what you have. So nobody has luck that they put on like a designer gown is the word I use, and they always have it and they wear it and no one can touch them.
Correct.
Just by chance, some people are super lucky. So a friend of mine once said to me, well, in backgammon, when you use the doubling cube, sometimes a certain game will become very important, because the doubling cube is a device that lets you raise the stake of the game. But if the game turns around a few times, you raise it, then your opponent raises it, then you raise it, then your opponent raises it. All the time, sudden you're playing for a big amount of money, much more than you started with. And now at that point, you can become if things went wrong just a few times in those crucial games in your life, and this is one of the brightest guys I ever talked to or knew, pointed out to me, no matter how good you were, you would be kaput. You'd be toast. So, but that would put you in the unluckiest 1/100th of 1% of people. So it's just a matter of, yes, you have to play your cards well, and you're dealt, you're dealt good dice and bad dice constantly.
Mm-hmm. Now, that's very interesting because when you compare Backgammon with life and how you have to deal with things that happen in life, like unexpectedly, you do not ask for some of the incidents to happen in life, but you have to go through, and that is how you deal with the things that are presented to you in the Backgammon game itself. So um, with that, right? Because I came to learn that there are so many strategies in Backgammon, in playing Backgammon, and many people are actually devising their own strategies. So could you tell us a little bit about? I was just wondering how these strategies help Backgammon players to become a better player, or probably to increase their winning chance. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, backgammon is basically the most simple-minded part of it is that it's a race. You're going in one direction around the board. Your opponent's going in the other direction. If you roll bigger numbers than they do, you run faster and you win. Mm-hmm. But the reason it's such a good game is because there are two features that complicate that. And this is because you're going one way, I'm getting confused with my hands here. You go one way, your opponent goes the other way, so that means that your pieces intersect. That's what they have. Contact is the word that we use in backgammon to describe that. And what that means is that there are two things that the pieces can do to each other that make the game strategically complicated. The first is that they can block each other. When you put two of your pieces on a point, the opponent can't occupy that point. And if you put your pieces on points in a row, your opponent can't jump over them. So you can trap your opponent. By the same token, he can trap you, or she can trap you. And the other aspect of backgammon is that if a piece is left singly, alone, we call it a blot, then if you land on it, you can send it back, which is part of other games too. It's not unique to backgammon. But once a piece is sent back, you can create a blockade within your own home so that the piece can't re-enter the game, and then you're winning. So there are those structures that go on. There's the race, there's the blocking, and there's the hitting. And a lot of the game depends on when to employ these different strategies, and having the tactics to employ them. But basically, the most interesting thing that happens in backgammon that some people get a little bit too enamored with is that if you get if you can get a lot of your pieces hit so that they go back, then you can wait for your opponent to bring his pieces forward, and meanwhile you create a trap on the other side of the board. And then when your opponent finally leaves something open, you hit it and he's stuck behind your trap, and then you just run the rest of your back checkers around. And that's called a back game. But the art of the game and what you learn after many years is when to employ which strategies, and how to not fall in love with anything. You can't say, oh, well, I'm a this kind of player, or I'm a this kind of player. It's all being opportunistic and knowing how to draw your sword when, and how to back up when, and how to use some judo too, and let them overextend themselves, that kind of thing.
Now, very interestingly put, Robert. Now, I mean, I'm particularly very intrigued the moment you compared, Backgammon with how you deal with the things that happen in life. And I think it makes more sense when you put it in that, in that way, or probably when you compare it in that way, and you can see some, oh, okay, this is how it works, right? And also, in one point of time, you in your website, I could see that you actually mentioned that Backgammon is actually a sport, right? So, how do you see this as a sport, and how do Backgammon players actually can be compared to athletes? Could you tell us about that? Like, how do you categorize that? How do you see that as sport?
Well, that's I mean, you created a nice segue for me there, Jasmina, because it's very interesting that sport itself, we don't think about sport the way we should. We don't really reflect on what sport is. And sport meant something different to people hundreds of years ago, too. There's a famous quotation, if I can get it right, which is that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. Now, Eton is an exclusive boys' school in Britain, and the British beat Napoleon at Waterloo. But what the author of that phrase was saying is that the young men who eventually became soldiers learned how to fight through sport. And the important thing that they learned is to have courage, because the sport that they were doing, was quite physical and exhausting and cruel, and you could get hurt and you couldn't cry. You had to be a man and to have an attitude where you were going to fight to the end. And that's what British soldiers did in battles. Where they looked at those battles as games. And if you think about sport, a lot of the physical activities that you do are preparation, or you can think of them as the sorts of things you would do in a war. In a war, before we had guns and bombs and things like that, you would be fighting, you would be dueling. I mean, you have fencing, which is actually a sport where you're actually learning to use a sword. But wrestling, for example, boxing, throwing even a ball is like throwing a spear. All these things are the tools that a warrior would take into battle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now we live in a different age. It's not quite so direct and so physical. And now we fight much more with our minds. And we people who, especially the ones of us who live in capitalism, we are always having to calculate, and we're always having to decide which is the better way to go and which way the odds favor us. So the games that are always models, and that's why people like them. I mean, the reason they like them is because they understand that on some level that this is a model of life, and that just as a person, they may, people are cruel too. They like to see people lose, and sometimes it's because they know they're losers, and there are even these people who, I mean, the whole idea of being a fan is very interesting too, because we all want to associate ourselves with winners, but and we're loyal to our team and our community and our little area that we're from. But you find fans who are so cruel and who say the nastiest things to the players because they feel like they're losers themselves and they want to get some satisfaction because there's always somebody bigger who can beat up the guy who beat you up. So that's a real pleasure that you get. So games are they have a lot more meaning to us than we realize. And so, as does sport. I mean, the amount of effort and the amount of thought that goes into sport and commenting on sport and watching it and analyzing it nowadays is tremendous. And so, games that are mental are just as demanding, and a lot of times they're more demanding because you have to keep trying to do the right thing, just like the soldier, just like the British schoolboy in Eton. You have to keep fighting and not dither and lose your mind, and so they're I think they're comparable.
Right. So we have Judy over here asking us a question about when you're publishing your the next book, which is the Vocabulary of Backgammon book, right? So
that's Judy. Yeah.
Yes. Maybe you could also explain to us about your the Backgammon Chronicles, and if non-Backgammon players can actually also read the book, and how friendly it is to those who are like super new to Backgammon game, and also about the upcoming book that you have, the Vocabulary of Backgammon book. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, my dream or my ambition, let's say, is that my books can reach some of the people in what I would call the non-technical backgammon world. The people in the backgammon world it's small. It's a few thousand people who are super dedicated, and they speak a language that they understand. It involves a lot of statistics and mathematics, and there are terms that they use that, as I was writing the books, and the friend of mine who I mentioned before, who was the philosophy PhD, didn't understand some stuff that I was really shocked at, but it was because he didn't know the language of backgammon. So that's the name of I was going to write a glossary, but a glossary is something that you add to a book, and it only includes the words that the person needs that actually occur in the book. So I figured, oh, come on, write a dictionary. There never has been one. And what I find interesting is that backgammon's in a transition. What happened is in early 1990s, actually, they developed these computer programs that analyze the game in a incredibly good way, and people sort of had to become little computers of their own to keep up with them and to compete with one another. But backgammon came from a gambling world. And the gambling world is a fascinating place because gambling has always had a bad reputation. I think that's unfair, and I hope to change that in the future. But people who are gamblers have always lived in an underworld, sort of like criminals. And what that means is that you create your own ethics. You don't go by the law because you have your own law.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't go by the rules because you have your own rules. And then you have your language. And your language is one that uses the ideas of luck and of the attitudes, sometimes not so scientific, more on the non-scientific side of how the world treats you. And a gambler might say, that's a nasty roll of the dice that you just got, which means that a car came by and splashed mud on you. Well, that's you're not rolling well today, they might say. So what I tried to do in this book is to, again, before it disappears, to capture a lot of this language that that gamblers use with one another, but also to include all the more difficult technical stuff and try to describe it as simply as possible so that the words are clearly defined. And my hope is that's a little bit of kind of what I call a Rosetta Stone. That was the famous stone that I think it was, maybe which language they were able to translate once they found the stone. It might have been, I don't think it was Egyptian, but it was some other language. But anyway, I mean, I would like people to be able to read my books, and once in a while, where I say that the normative equity is this or that they can just look it up and go, oh, that's what he means, and continue reading, because my books are storybooks, and you can read them without really knowing everything, all that technical stuff. And they have a lot of pictures too, really nice photographs. So you can just like I did when I was a kid and I was reading chess books. I would read the stories and I wouldn't really understand the positions very well, but I knew that I liked what I was reading, and I felt like, oh, I know what they're talking about. I know what they're talking about. So that's my hope. Maybe it'll be more popular just with the real technicians who will say, well, finally, now we have a clear definition of that term. But I'm hoping it'll be more than that, and it'll be something that common, people who aren't super booked up in backgammon can relate to.
Right. So I'm actually screening or sharing the screen with viewers today, your website, which is the backgammonchronicles.com. So I believe that your books are actually available on Amazon, and they can get it on Amazon. All right.
Yes,
So,
by the way, the dictionary. I should have said the dictionary will be out in a few weeks. It's not.
awesome.
Sorry.
Right. Awesome. Right. So that's the website, thebackgammonchronicles.com. So, so I have another question for you, because in the beginning of the interview, you did mention that your parents were like not very happy of you playing chess, and and therefore you had to go back to school and do the normal things that any kids would do at your age. Now, Speaking about your book and also speaking about reading, I mean, reaching out to a wider audience, right? So, how would you see Backgammon being more accepted in the among the public? And how do you think parents or probably uh, teachers, educators out there should see Backgammon or should see kids who are approaching to learn how to play Backgammon or any type of games out there? How do they? How are they supposed to actually encourage that?
Well, that's my next book.
Uh-huh.
It's called The Virtues of Gambling.
Awesome. Uh-huh.
And it's actually a justification for gambling, and in it I explain that society has a dysfunctional attitude toward gambling out of fear. It's mostly puritanical fear too.
Mm-hmm.
The Puritan is someone who's, of course, the real Puritans were against dancing, singing, drinking, sex, anything that would take your mind off God and work. And actually, work was only something that was good because it kept your mind on God, and because you couldn't really get distracted too easily because you were suffering. But Western society has a huge phobia about people doing things that aren't constructive and that might create an alternative to work. And gambling is one of those things, and the idea that the Puritans had is that in gambling you want to get something for nothing. This is very contrary to what is called the Protestant ethic. The Protestant ethic means you work hard and you'll be rewarded, and even if you're not rewarded, God will be very proud of you, and that's good enough. But the Puritan, is very afraid that people will get the wrong idea, and they'll think, oh, all I need to do is roll the dice and I win, and then who needs to work? But the interesting thing is that among players like me, when we're not playing a game that's 100% luck, but has a lot of luck in it, there's actually a work ethic. And the one who works the hardest will win all the money. So when you think about what capitalism is, it's a big game where people are playing all the time and trying to outsmart one another. And the ones who are the quickest and the smartest and take advantage of the opportunities and calculate carefully and don't get full of themselves when they start to win and think they're God or anything like that, but just are sober and keep their wits about them. Those are the ones who make it and win. They go to the top. They become billionaires, billion, whatever. And to me, that's something you should learn when you're 5 years old, not when you're 25, not when you're 50, right away. You should learn it right away. The way that gambling is structured in our society is people are told, don't gamble until you're old enough. Then you can go to a casino. But if you go to a casino, you can't win because the games are constructed so that you can't win. But that's all backwards. What you should do is when you're 5 years old, you should flip cards. I used to flip cards with my friends to win bottle caps or whatever, but you should have little competitions where you can use your wits and learn a little bit of math so that
Mm-hmm.
try to get ahead of the others.
Mm-hmm.
By the time you're 12 or 13 or 15, you're already programmed correctly now.
Mm-hmm.
You're correctly programmed for the life that you're going to be leading,
Mm-hmm.
or you're going to have to buy insurance or
Mm-hmm.
think
Yeah,
about your medical,
correct.
everything is a calculation in life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's actually the correct thing to do would be to teach gambling in school and to teach people how to make those kinds of decisions as young as possible so that it becomes second nature. It's not like what is this? Like, I can roll the dice and win. No, you can't. You have to always be aware of what you're doing and use your luck constructively.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's
Yes, excellent. I mean, that was really eye-opening. I mean, in terms of how you put it in a very attractive way to encourage people to see how Backgammon is not just about gambling, but it's also about how you see life in general and how you deal with luck and also how you deal with your potentials, right? So,
and with your own personality, with your own emotions.
yes, absolutely. Right. So, what is the message? I mean, as we are coming closer to the end of our show today, what would you like to tell viewers out there, and what's the message that you would want to relay to audience later? I mean, this interview will be available to for replay anytime. As soon as this interview ends, it will be live on Facebook, and I'll be putting it up on YouTube as well and LinkedIn. So, what is the message that you have out there for people?
Well, I mean, the philosophical message is the one we just talked about, where gambling, or backgammon is life, and it's teaches you these wonderful lessons, but it's also just extremely fun. It's a really interesting game, and it's fun because there's so much drama in it. The drama is created by the dice, but also by the way you deal with the dice. And as I say, it's a game that was through, like, the conservative always says, well, we shouldn't change things because many centuries people, there was a man and a woman, and that's all it ever was. And I'm not like that, but there's something to that too. And there's something to the fact that, yeah, anybody can make a game. You can make any kind of game you want. But some games are much better than others because they have a beautiful balance. And backgammon is like that. That's why it's 5,000 years old, and it's still, it's still. Although the doubling cube, when it was invented in the 1920s, as I say, gave it another dimension. But
right.
But it's just a really cool game, and it's wonderful. And unfortunately or fortunately, there are computers that play better than computers, and you just cannot beat the computer. So what all of us do in the backgammon world is we learn from the computer. And there are some stories I tell in the book of the computer has one or two big flaws, and some people made a huge bet that the computer could beat anybody, but a really smart friend of mine beat the computer because he figured out that it's perfect.
Right.
And in the end, those are great stories, and it's like, we're coming to the age of artificial intelligence too, and a lot of people are worrying about that. What are we humans going to do? Like, what's left for us? But it's everywhere. Artificial intelligence is everywhere, especially on Facebook. Where they're figuring out what you're thinking all the time.
Correct.
Like
Yes.
throwing advertisements at you before you even know that you want something. So
Right.
our artificial intelligence is smarter than we are in a lot of ways. But
Right.
yeah, anyway.
Awesome. Right. So thank you so much for sharing your extensive experience in the Backgammon as a professional Backgammon player, and also in the field of Backgammon sports itself, right? So I think definitely the audience and also I have learned a lot about Backgammon today, and also about your new book, the language of Backgammon, and also your existing series, which is the Backgammon Chronicles, right? So thank you so much for joining us, Robert. It was an absolute pleasure to have you on Sunday evening today with you, and I hope that our viewers have also enjoyed watching this interview. So thank you so much, and hoping to have you on another show, hopefully in the next shows that I have to come. So thank you so much, Robert. We've come to the end of the show right now. So thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome, Jasmina. You're a wonderful host.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Bye. Bye.